Yeah.
'Cause to be human is to have limitation. It's to grow tired. It's to rest. It's to have, I think, healthy sense of what is right and wrong. And yet, as the Genesis narrative would tell us, like our foreparents, they sort of walked away from this. They chose their own way. And so I think that also speaks to us what it is, what image bearing is it's more of an indication of potential. And the church fathers, they talked a lot about this because there's a sense of they had a strong differentiation between being image bearers of God and bearing God's likeness.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today again. And before I get into today's discussion, I just want you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to share it. And because we have an exciting episode for you today. And joining me again on the show is Paul Walker. He's going to share with us a little bit today I'm just going to go ahead and let him share a little bit about that. But I want to give him maybe just a few minutes to discuss a little bit about himself and where he is. And I know that he's pastoring a church, so I want to give him that opportunity just to introduce himself.
So yes, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Alec, for just inviting me here to just be with you again. It's always a joy to talk to you. I just enjoy our time every time we get together and enjoy our classes way back in the day. So that's
Yeah.
really great. Yeah. So where I'm at these days is up until it was about May of this year, I was the teaching pastor at the meeting place. But I was really kind of sensing that it was time to close that chapter. And so I did that. And I did this sort of leap of faith where I just let my church know, okay, I'm going to be considering something else. I closed that chapter out. There's a whole story there.
Mhm.
Good story, but like just lots of learning. And then I found myself searching for where would I land in the fall. And we were considering a couple churches across Canada, but a church here in Winnipeg reached out to us and just asked us to consider being their interim pastor for a short time. And
Oh, okay.
as I got to know about them, my heart grew. It grew.
Yeah.
My heart was strangely warmed,
Mhm.
to quote Wesley. And so
Yeah.
I found
Yeah.
myself just saying, yeah, I can see myself serving you as your intentional interim transitional pastor for the next couple months. So kind of that's where I've landed, and that's where I speak to you from. Is we're in the North Kildonan area of Winnipeg, which is like lots of historic churches here, lots of kind of
Yeah.
Mennonite,
Yeah.
Anabaptist type churches, and I'm serving in a church called Douglas Mennonite Church.
Oh, right on. Right on. Yeah, it's so interesting. You run into so many people, and if I could just share this real quick, um, you mentioned it already that we had gone way back in years ago when both you and I were in seminary, and
Mhm.
and I do remember we were able to sit down together over lunch, and it was just the conversation that we had. It was very interesting. I'm not sure if you remember it. But we started talking about denominations, and
Mhm.
we got to jump into things like Pentecostalism and Anglican, and on and
Mhm.
on and so forth. And I was so amazed even just by some of the conversations that we had even during class as well. And I'm so glad that we were able to connect together because we did share another podcast a couple of years ago, I think it was.
Mhm.
And just the conversation overall was so interesting, and I knew for sure that I had to have you back. And so I
Oh,
um
well, thanks.
I really enjoyed even just preparing. You and I were talking about back and forth about some possibilities of what we could discuss on today's program, because one of the things that I've been feeling was and I've actually been learning about this over the last year, maybe longer than that, was the whole idea of uh, human theology. Now, for some people, that might sound a little bit strange, and
Mhm.
for that reason, for that reason, because I know we're going to be talking about it, because I kind of held on to this title was was embrace your humanity. Because I know that a lot of Christian people in the Christian church, especially, they kind of have this idea that we want to, discard our humanity and totally embrace spirituality. So I kind of want to run off that idea, and I wish I had some time to really talk more about that as to what we're saying. But I want to give you that opportunity is to like what does that mean for you? As you know, I know that you are a teacher. I know that you've
Mhm.
spent some time in seminary, and just knowing, the knowledge that you have. Which direction would like to go in that?
Well, I think the first initial response to the idea of embrace our humanity is perhaps to explore why is it that some feel uncomfortable with that?
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a particular stream within North America that struggles to recognize what it means to be human. That
Yeah.
the spirituality tends to be an escapist sort of
Right.
depiction.
Yeah.
I would say kind of the streams you and I originally found ourselves in, certainly Pentecostal charismatic streams. Uh, Partly what did this to us is we weren't quite sure what to make with the rhythms of the week.
Mm.
Um, Pentecostals were very excited about like ecstatic experiences within the sort of congregational setting, like
Yeah.
the Sunday morning service, the Sunday evening service, maybe even the midweek service, and a lot of the spirituality that we found ourselves discovering, and there's some health there. I don't want to throw the baby out with the
No,
bathwater. Is
no, no.
sort of the shared like spiritual gifts, the
Yeah.
shared experiences of like maybe speaking in tongues or
Sure. Yeah.
having these just intense movements of the spirit in worship and just finding ourselves caught up in adoration. And so there's this transcendent side to sort of Pentecostalism and some also other movements, right? Like this can be found in Catholicism and
Sure. Yeah.
Anglicanism. Certainly the charismatic renewal has touched different parts of the church. But but one of the dangers of this movement is we can get so caught up in sort of the transcendence that we lose immanence.
Mm.
And I think it's
Hmm.
so
Right.
curious that you
Right.
and
Yeah.
I are having this conversation because this Sunday we're beginning Advent. Advent
Okay.
begins December
Okay.
1st,
Yeah.
2024.
Yeah.
And Advent reminds us that transcendence and immanence are held together,
Hmm.
that the God of the universe, the Word, the Logos, was made what? Flesh,
Flesh. That's right.
flesh. Sarx in meat. Literally, you could translate it that way. And so we have this spirituality that if we find ourselves in the way of Jesus, we should find ourselves radically within and in fleshness,
Yep.
right? Like I think of John 1 verse 14. I think Eugene Peterson translates it that God moved into the neighborhood, right?
Mm.
Like there is
Wow.
this God is in our neighborhood. And yet I think for many Pentecostals, charismatic, those within that transcendent tradition,
Yes.
um, there's sort of a I'll fly away, oh glory.
All right. Oh, don't get me going now with that.
Yeah. And I think largely what did this to us is our like Pentecostalism in some ways is a over-realized eschatology.
Hmm.
And then we also, I think we just had and we received poor eschatology.
Right.
Um, like we spent a lot of time talking about, things like the rapture, even though that didn't show up in scripture at all. And so when
Hmm.
when your
Hmm.
ultimate kind of conception of where it's all headed is this, well, my soul will float off to a cloud somewhere in the sky,
Somewhere. Yeah.
isn't it not surprising that Pentecostals failed to have an imminence in their
Hmm.
transcendence?
That's right.
Is And I think that's unique because I actually find that most of the Western church suffers with the exact opposite. We're far too imminent and we could use a bit of the gift of transcendence. So it's
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
interesting that we all land in some specific ditches there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
especially as we think of our eschatology, this is why eschatology matters.
Yeah.
And to your listening audience,
Yeah.
eschatology is like the study of kind of the end times type
That's
thing.
right. Yeah.
And I think like what really kind of shook my world, but also helped me healthily to land within a historic Christian tradition on this,
Yeah.
was reading the works of Bishop N.T. Wright.
Right.
And
Yeah.
specifically, he would point out that, if we're going to use an R word for eschatology, the R word that's in scripture is not rapture, it's resurrection.
That's right. That's right.
And again, resurrection is not soul floating up to the sky. Resurrection is what has happened to Jesus in the middle of history, the age to come, breaking in our old languishing age, to use the language of Galatians 1, will happen to us because our salvation, and again, there's so much theology that helps inform like a better picture of what
Yeah.
is going to happen for us. But our salvation is that we are in Christ. And as Romans 6 would say, and in the same way that we are baptized into his death, we will be raised with him in his
That's
resurrection.
right.
And
That's right.
so where it's all headed for us, to get back to your initial conversation of like embrace your humanity, embrace your embodiedness,
Hmm.
is that our resurrected bodies, well, they're going to be bodies. We're not going to be souls floating into some, Philly cheese commercial cloud in the sky.
Outer
Uh,
space somewhere.
yeah,
What's that song called? Somewhere in outer space, God has prepared a place. I'm not sure if you've heard that song
I,
before. It was a Sunday
thankfully I
school song.
haven't, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that's part of like, so I want to start there because I wanted to name like, how did we get to the place that for some they feel uncomfortable about embracing humanity? And I think part of it maybe even some misinterpretation of like the language in Galatians 5, the flesh and then the
Yeah,
spirit. And I think that can wrongly tell us, a poor interpretation of that would say, oh, anything human is just sinful and done with. And,
right.
if we're going to be people of the spirit, it means like somehow that doesn't show up in our experience as humans. And actually want to just correct that the flesh is the disorderedness
Yeah,
of our desires. It's our humanity disordered. And the spirit is not, again, the spirit is not a disembodied spirit.
hmm.
It's the spirit of Christ. When we
Yes,
see Jesus get baptized, the Holy Spirit descends where? On the body of Christ.
on the
And
body.
that means
Right.
and that means for us that spirituality is actually radically embodied,
Hmm.
uh, because who gave us our bodies to begin with? And again, this is helping us to see the big story. Our bodies are a gift. We are created in the image of God, says
That's right.
Genesis 1.
That's
And
right.
so I just think like our starting place is going to speak to us on this. And that's why, again, it just seems my starting place was very much spirituality as an escape mechanism. And I can understand why that came about. I mean, many early uh, Pentecostals actually found themselves very much with the poor, with the disenfranchised, with those that were suffering. They were not a movement among the academics. They were
Yeah,
a movement with those who were in pain. And there is something about, you do want to hold out a future hope.
yeah.
You do want to speak of heaven. You do want to speak to. I'm not saying throw out transcendence. We need
Yes,
transcendence.
sure,
It's
absolutely.
just we need that deeply within our immanence, and also we need a well-formed transcendence. And I think again, Pentecostalism tended in unhealthy ways, where it goes off the rails is when we inherited more of an American kind of eschatology, when
Right. Yeah,
we inherited, like uh, a theology of the rapture, and we weren't connected to the big story of the church. I
that's right.
find so much of our theology it can it can find itself more grounded and healthy when we realize that we don't get to make it up, that we are
Mm.
part of a received tradition. And so I think as Pentecostals, largely, I think as I'm observing the global Pentecostal church, they are moving towards more healthy expressions slowly but surely.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think there was
and
a
I've
lot of,
seen that.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I've seen that. Even, I attended a Pentecostal Bible college for the
Mhm.
first 3 years. This was back in like in 1999, and very, very deep in Pentecostalism, and of course it was predominantly Pentecostal, like right to the bone, the like it was all about traditional Pentecostalism, right? And like what you said, you talk about the rapture and and experiential side of the Pentecostal movement. And but I kind of want to kind of go back to what you said earlier because I know that it may have already struck a nerve with some of our viewers. We know as soon as you mentioned the rapture, and instead of, and I totally agree because you mentioned about N.T. Wright, and
Mhm.
I read some of his writings, and he does talk about rapture versus resurrection, and I totally agree 100% because when you look at the overall picture, and I read about it in the book of Hebrews, and where it says that you should leave these elementary principles of the church and move on to maturity. Now, it's interesting that in those six
Mhm.
steps of those six steps of elementary principles, one of them is included the resurrection of the dead.
Yeah.
Now, I actually did a study on this, and I preached a couple of messages on it. When we think about the resurrection of the dead, we automatically think, well, we're laying hands on a dead body and raise them back to life again, or we refer to even to the resurrection of Jesus himself, right? But I think it goes much deeper than that. And the reason
Yes, it
why,
does.
yeah,
Yes.
and the reason why I want to say this because I want to just address my audience real quick that there was just so much more to this Christian walk than just being able to be caught up into the clouds together and being raised up. But there is something much more to the plan and purpose of God when we talk about the resurrection because um, you know, because I think this really goes against things like the Hal Lindsey type end times preaching,
Mhm.
right? And I know that so many Western Christianity has adopted, this whole idea of the end of the world, collapse and the mark of the beast, Antichrist, and all that stuff. I mean, maybe you and I should have a conversation about that on maybe
Yeah.
another recording. I mean, but the reason why I wanted to just kind of clarify maybe just a little bit about that before we go on, because one example I'm looking at, and maybe you can kind of jump in here, is I think we've kind of missed the mark, especially when it comes to Pentecostalism, because what example I think of is when they had built the Tower of Babel, and which direction were they trying to build? They were trying to build vertically, right? They built this tower up into heaven. And it was almost like as if, because at first God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. And so they kind of lost that vision. They lost that plan, that purpose for themselves because he said, go out, be fruitful and and multiply. And so God had to bring them back down from that Tower of Babel because they lost the purpose. They were so focused on going up rather than going out to be fruitful and multiply. And I think we kind of find ourselves caught up in that same scenario again. We're so focused on going up rather than going out, being fruitful and multiply. And the reason why I say that is because when we look at the Garden of Eden, it was just a small little geographical location on this planet Earth that they probably had no idea it existed. And so God was saying to them, go be fruitful and multiply because the rest of the world needed to look like the Garden of Eden. And
Yeah.
so,
Like, well, and I think you're getting at something that certainly I would want to dial in on is as
yeah,
we
yeah,
consider what it means to embrace our humanity, is that what we're saying, I think, in that, at least in a proper kind of like historical Christian sense,
yeah,
is that we are being image bearers of God,
that's
which is
right.
this idea of being stewards of creation, of being people of the earth. I mean, Adam means, uh, Adama in Hebrew, which is of the earth,
Of
right?
the earth, yes.
Adam from the Adama. And so it's like We are dirt people in that sense, but dirt people that have been breathed upon by God
That's
and the
right.
Holy Spirit. And so we are energized and made for what? For, well, I mean, this idea of an image bearer kind of goes back towards this sort of like understanding in ancient cultures of like temples and then icons.
Hmm.
So it's this idea of like we represent the deity,
Right.
and yet essentially what the Hebrew manuscripts are doing, what the Hebrew scriptures are doing, is they're pointing to us as we represent God in this earth. We bear his image on the creation. So
That's right.
as Genesis 1 would say, have dominion, not in a
Dominion.
conquering sense, but in a stewardship sense.
That's right.
Uh, be fruitful and multiply. Be these people that tend to the earth. And within that, God gives us healthy boundaries at
Hmm.
the which I think is also a part of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
'Cause to be human is to have limitation. It's to grow tired. It's to rest. It's to have, I think, healthy sense of what is right and wrong. And yet, as the Genesis narrative would tell us, like our foreparents, they sort of walked away from this. They chose their own way, and so I think that also speaks to us what it is, what image bearing is it's
Yep.
more of an indication of potential. And the church fathers, they talked a lot about this because there's a sense of they had a strong differentiation between being image bearers of God and bearing God's likeness.
Hmm.
And so a lot of like the early church fathers, like Gregory of Nyssa and many others, would say that God created us with potential, but the potential was always to be realized. It wasn't
Hmm.
sort of like this without fault, sinless state. It was
Yeah.
always, we were always made independent of God. We were made for a relationship, and out of that relationship, our maturity would come. I believe it was Irenaeus that talked about this as well. He also said that like the glory of God is man fully alive or humanity fully alive. So there's this
Wow.
sense of like God
Wow.
is working through his image bearers to bring God's rule and reign on the earth, but that was disrupted. And and I think this has a bigger conversation about like this whole area of theology we called what is it called again? Well, it's essentially a theology of sin. I'm
Hmm.
thinking, uh, yeah. Anyway, the word is escaping me right now.
Yeah.
But theology of sin is so often we've moralized it in a sense of like list of right and wrongs. But the heart of sin is actually a failure to reflect God's goodness in the world. So it's much less a no list as much as it's a yes list,
Hmm.
right? Like
Yeah.
at the heart of what it means to be fully human is to have ourselves deeply in connection with God.
Yeah.
And I think
And I think
that's
that's
what,
one of the
yeah,
that's what we really need to recognize, first of all. And you made a statement just earlier on that sometimes, I think we as Christians, we tend to forget, that Jesus was human after all.
yeah,
And
fully human,
he
fully
was, yeah,
God. This is
yeah,
why we need the creeds, right? Or even
yeah,
resurrection, the creed,
yeah.
all the creeds speak of the resurrection of the
Right.
dead.
And along with that humanity, we also have to recognize as well. And this may be, kind of a little bit off the wall a little bit. And because, you know, Jesus got hungry. If he
Yeah,
got hungry, he ate.
yeah,
If he needed to do number two, he went
yes,
and did it,
yeah,
right? So
yes,
we forget these sort of things. And if he worked hard, he sweat. And
mhm,
if he was tired, he rested, he slept. Of course, we know of if he felt emotional, he cried, and
yeah,
so on and so forth. And so sometimes we kind of fail to recognize these simple things of everyday human
mhm.
reactions or emotions, that Jesus himself felt.
Absolutely,
And so,
absolutely,
but,
right?
but but let's forget about all that and let's just focus on what walking on water and
Mm,
walking through a group of people so that he can escape from being thrown off a cliff or sort of thing, or
mhm.
turning the water into turning water into wine and multiplying loaves and fishes and healing the sick and so on and so forth. And these are the sort of things we want to focus in on, but at the same time, he was still very much involved in humanity, walking amongst humanity as a human being, like what I think was the Hebrew writer says, in all points tempted as we are. So he had temptations, right? And he was walking amongst us, like all like everything that we were probably experiencing here in ourselves. And I think that's really need to focus in on that as much as we do, the spiritual side and the supernatural part of the life of ministry of Jesus.
This is why scripture calls Jesus the second Adam,
Hmm.
right? Is that
Yep.
he, like to use a theological term, Jesus is the recapitulation.
Hmm.
He lives our side of the covenant and models to us what true humanity is.
Yep.
And like even his miracles, these are a dependence on the Holy Spirit, on God. He's modeling what it means for us. Everything.
Yeah.
This is why he says to his disciples, greater things you will do.
Will do.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think like that's so significant as we consider our own participation in both this transcendence but in our immanence. So I want to say why, again, another reason why I think that we find ourselves, or some segments of the church find themselves almost dismissing the humanness,
Hmm.
is that it's largely a byproduct of the Enlightenment, where we
Yes.
sort of
Yes,
bifurcated the intellect and the emotion
for
and the
sure.
body. But for Jesus, they're radically connected. And I think we would probably find ourselves in a lot more healthier place if we had a more Jewish looking understanding
Right. Exactly.
of spirituality than a sort of like postmodern, Westernist, post Enlightenment understanding.
Hmm.
Because Jewish faith is, if it's anything, it's radically earthy, right?
Right.
You have rhythms like Sabbath,
Mm.
rhythms like what to do with your crops, rhythms like what to do with the humanness,
Yeah.
and these are found within our context, not away from them.
Hmm. And I totally agree 100% because I would honestly say that my theology has basically changed dramatically because I've taken more of a from a Jewish perspective than I would from my Pentecostal roots, so to speak. And it's just interesting you say that because when we think of, if I can just use this as an example, because when I know that the idea of money, I think, plays a really big role in this because when a lot of people like to say that um, the root of all evil is, or how does that go? Is money
Money is the root of all evil.
well
Yeah.
evil, right? But they kind of have this little twist to it, and they say that money is evil, or the money is so on and so forth. But yet at the same time, this really does come from a whole you mentioned enlightenment, and it really goes way back to the idea of Gnosticism, right?
I
And
mean, yeah, I mean, there's Gnosticisms in the
yeah,
early church, but certainly Gnosticism as the church reacted happened more in like the third, fourth century.
yeah,
And it was really this understanding of like secret knowledge and this
yes,
understanding of like almost a Platonism in a devaluing of the body and a heightening of sort of an ecstatic spiritual
I
experience.
say, yeah.
Um, this idea of like a soul floating off to the sky. That's kind of where it gets its roots from. And
Mhm.
Gnosticism, famously like had some very misguided claims about Jesus. And the
Mhm.
church, I think largely what the church did was have conversations and address that. And I'm thankful that so many of these early discussions happened in the
Mhm.
early church so that we can glean from that wisdom. But again, coming out of that, we have things like the Nicene Creed about the natures of Christ,
That's right.
that
Yeah.
the Christ's nature is fully God, fully man, and they're not divided.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
because what they were saying about that is what they're saying about the humanity of Jesus is ultimately what applies to us, as Jesus is, to quote Hebrews 2, the pioneer of our salvation. He's the
Mhm.
one that goes forward. He models the way. He's the recapitulation.
Right.
And all of that teaches us about humanness. Like think about Jesus' humanness in a sense, and it's weird to talk about that in absence of his divinity. I'm not trying to, but
Mm.
certainly, like you were already saying, that he grew tired, that he
Yeah.
rested,
Yeah.
um, that he Sabbathed. And I think perhaps in our digital age, where we all feel sort of almost detached, we all feel like avatars out in the digital world. Embodiedness matters even more, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think when we're embodied with others, that works against loneliness, or at least it has the potential. When we're embodied, we find ourselves far more grounded in what it means to live out spiritual practices.
Yeah.
Uh, and so much of like, things like prayer, things like fasting, it's hard. It's hard to do fasting without acknowledging you have a body, right? And I think
Oh man, that's
I,
right.
and then like also to just speak about this is like I think also something we forget about, and in some streams of the church, is the theology of Monday to Saturday. That
Wow.
doesn't
Yeah.
like that God has something to say about that, about how we work, about how we play, about how we value family, about all sorts of things. Um, I think also it's there's something curious I think about our spirituality when we can't have anything to say about resurrection or even just the topic of death and
Yeah.
bodies in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
A part of me wonders of like the separation of spirituality is sort of like this category over here actually help perpetuate so much injustice in the world,
Hmm.
because all of a sudden when your spirituality needs to be grounded, it actually has to say something about how you treat your real embodied neighbor,
Hmm.
how you treat your African neighbor or
Yeah.
your indigenous neighbor or your European neighbor. It actually says something about that.
Yeah.
And if you think bodies are something to be escaped rather than something that God is wondrously given us, I think it has the danger of doing that.
Hmm. Yeah. I think there's a lot of different directions, that you and I can probably go towards because I kind of find myself, when you mentioned about the Monday through Saturday theology, right? Because we're obviously, we're so good on Sunday morning or whenever we go to our places of worship. And, my mind was already thinking about and like you said it exactly, is that social media has almost created this perspective or this worldview for us because you think of things like Instagram or maybe even Snapchat or TikTok. And what is the majority that these social media platforms have? They're called filters, right? So basically, we're almost deceiving the world into thinking like this is how we look like, or we're portraying to the world of how we look like
Mm,
to as opposed to how we look like in the real world to the other people that are physically connected with on an everyday level. And
mhm.
so, and I think overall, I think we've kind of almost adopted that whole mindset for ourselves when we think about our lives as Christian people. You know, we put on okay, we're gonna get on a device, we're gonna put on the filter for Sunday morning, and all of a sudden the filter is gone because we're back at our workplace, we're back at our homes, we're back with our friends, and so on and so forth, right? And
Mhm.
so, and this is where the real part of our humanity starts to really, I guess, if I could put it this way, show its ugly face,
Mm,
So what do we do with that? Right? Because during the week, we're obviously going to make mistakes. We're not going to say the right words. So I think we kind of struggle sometimes when we start to aim for perfectionism.
mm.
And when we don't reach that, then we start to get all hard on ourselves. And I
Well,
think
mm.
this is one of the reasons why I really feel, that make us realize that we are still human.
Part of it is we've put an impossible burden on, our congregations, on the people in our church,
Yeah.
because it's like we cultivate so much of our spirituality around the 90 minutes they're in a building once a week,
Yeah.
and we haven't joined them in the week. We haven't gone with them. And even more, even if we acknowledge that we're sending them out perhaps through a missional lens,
Hmm.
we tend to approach that very individualistically,
Yeah.
rather rather than communal discernment, communal practices. If what it means to be human is fundamentally caught within relationship, I mean, we see that in Genesis 1 and 2. God says that it's not good for the man to be alone,
Hmm.
which tells me that, like, part of our, and our capacity, our likeness to be like God, is to be like God in perfect relationship,
Yeah.
because the Trinity is perfect love in relationship.
Hmm.
Um, perfect other-centeredness. So part of me just thinks that we've individualized it too much. We've asked people to go figure out who they are and how they exist in the world, and we've set up the Sunday morning experience more as an escape from that, rather than a launch into joining them in that. It's something that we would commune together.
Yeah. Yeah. And and you're totally right because I find, that whenever, like you said, when we are gathered together, and when I say we, I mean, I'm not talking just like my church, and I'm talking like church in general, that, we're so good at telling people, go and win the lost, and go and tell others about Jesus. And sometimes that doesn't always mean to say that you start talking about resurrection and rapture and the righteousness and holiness. And sometimes it's just being able to sit down together at the table with a coffee in front of you and just talking to another human being and
Yeah.
having a
Yeah.
normal human being
Yes.
conversation, right?
Again, like, to quote the Westminster Confession, it says, "The glory of man, or sorry, the glory of God is man fully alive." And they loosely took that from Irenaeus.
Yeah,
And I think there's this fully aliveness that I'm just as spiritual if I'm being a good father.
right.
I'm just as spiritual if the way I love my wife, which is why the New Testament has so many household kind of like sections in it. It's Our marriages are actually meant to model transcendence and immanence, because
Yes.
it's a
Yeah.
covenant relationship. Um, I'm spiritual in what I do with my money,
Mm,
because everything is spiritual in that sense,
yeah.
but it shows up within the framework of our lives, in the
Right.
decisions we make, and not apart from that.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Because I kind of find that, when we're talking about from a Jewish perspective, that everything was basically connected, because this goes all the way back to the time of creation. Because really what God was saying is that, when he created the trees, when he created the oceans, when he created the mountains, when he created the grass and everything that's in the world, he said it is good. But somehow, when we start to look at all these different things that are in the world, and we're coming up on Christmas, and people will say that, oh, the Christmas tree is bad, but really, in essence, and I know that maybe you can kind of highlight on this a little bit, because I'm not sure where you are in light of the idea of Halloween, because I know that there's a strong debate out there when it comes to people like to say, well, I'm not going to celebrate Halloween. I'm not gonna because that's the evil side, and so I'm not gonna even think of even dressing up. I'm not even gonna think about handing out a piece of candy or stuff like that. But at the same time, this is, I think this is kind of really has drawn so many people away from the church, because we've kind of draw the line somewhere. We create so many boundaries, that we cannot enjoy life to the fullest.
I
So,
mean, part of this wrestle was actually done in the early church as well, because they were wrestling like, what does it mean to buy? Because the cheapest meat you could buy in the town center was meat that had been offered to idols. And this becomes a whole debate in
yeah,
the early church, right? Is that for some people, their conscience is, they just couldn't allow it. And for others, they could. And what's so fascinating is that, like, especially as you read like Romans, like 14 and 15, or like First Corinthians, I believe it's 8 and 10, like Paul doesn't just come out on one side.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
and I just think that's so fascinating. Paul doesn't come out on one side. So
yeah.
I don't think we have to. I think we have to practice wise discernment and
Right.
um, wise just kind of like knowing what we're partnering with and what we're not. But I really love the movement to redeem things, because it seems
Yes,
that's what the early Christians did a lot, is
that's
they
right.
couldn't escape the messiness of a culture affected by sin, because we're all sinners. Sin is
That's
not
right.
out there, it's in us too.
Yep.
So they learn to capture it and change it.
Hmm.
Right. And I think that's what we can do as well. Like, especially around like, so at least in my area around like Halloween, like I don't know a single other time during the year I get to meet every single one of my neighbors, or I get to bless them with, hey, you want some candy? Here's some
Yeah,
candy.
yeah,
But I'm choosing how I will participate in that. And I would just
yeah,
pray wisdom for anyone that has to do the same. And I'll just say it gets messy. This is why we have these debates
yeah,
in the New Testament about
yeah,
meat and those practices. Is
yeah,
It's just part of the territory of the scandal of particularity, the
yeah,
scandal that the word became flesh.
yeah,
And so Jesus comes and he dwells with us. He moves into our neighborhood. I don't think we get to escape being within ours. That
yeah,
doesn't mean we participate or give allegiance or,
mm,
just give up in a sort of like throw our hands in the air.
yeah.
Wouldn't say that.
No, no,
But I don't think escapism has ever served the church.
no,
We're a
no.
city on a hill. We're salt of the earth,
Yeah,
salt and light, and those are ultimately forces that will have an effect of change, but it's never a retreat. Light
yeah,
doesn't know how not to shine.
yeah,
Salt doesn't know how not to alter salt. Right? It's
mm,
So we have to be those things. We have to embody an alternative reality.
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
about Stanley Hauerwas that says the first task of the church is to make the world the world. I think
Mm,
so often, especially in detached spiritualities, is that we can forget that the church is this alternative community, and that we're called to model this new humanity, this new healing of all things that God is about in the world. Because
yeah,
that's what we mean by resurrection. To tie us where
right.
we started in the conversation, is that God is coming and is already at work in this age. The new age is coming to break out. And what will break out? The healing of all things,
Mhm.
the restoration of all
That's
things.
right.
Um, that this world will be the way that God has intended it.
That's right. That's
And
right.
that is where it's all headed, bud.
Yeah, yeah, and you hit something there that caught my attention, and I totally agree. Is it's really all about the redeeming of all things, and the way I like to define this is that when you think about the story of God, and I know that there's a commentary series. I was talking to a gentleman just prior to this call, and there was a commentary section about it's called the story of God. So really, when you think about it, the story of God is basically the story of redemption because
Absolutely.
it was the bringing back of
Mm,
humankind, human beings, bringing
yeah.
them back into relationship. And when we talk, especially even about the idea of resurrection, it wasn't only just the redeeming of human beings; it was also the redeeming of human creation in the entire universe, especially. right? It was the redemption of the universe, the redemption of of God's entire creation. So when you take that into perspective of today's world, you know, and I think that should be our primary focus is to be able to redeem everything that's been lost. And I kind of want to throw this in as a as a bonus. And I have to do a little bit further study on it, but I think you know the idea of Halloween, and maybe you know about this, is that you know Halloween does have its origin and its roots going back to the church.
All Hallows Eve,
Oh, right
right?
on. Yeah,
Right?
you
Where
got it
All
right.
Saints Day, right?
All
And it was
Saints
this
Day. That's
idea
right.
of remembering the past humans,
That's right.
which were so easy to forget as
Yeah.
because modern people, we think we don't know who we are until we decide who we are. And we forget we're a part of a received story.
And that's exactly it, because along with that, I also think about you know the rainbow itself, something you know that we do need to take back as well. Because I know that, and I remember hearing this one statement a while ago that you know the devil never creates anything; he always steals something, and he
Yes.
distorts it, and
The
he
early church
infuses it.
talked
Yeah,
about this all the
yeah,
time, right? Because like darkness is not a thing. Augustine said evil is nothing. And by that he meant is it's always a privation. It's always a corruption of what is the good.
right. Exactly right. And I think this is kind of where we've missed it because, you know, when we think about our bodies, you know, we kind of think of them as, you know, they're just a bunch of, it is nothing but a dirty, rotten piece of flesh. And, you know, we kind of think, well, we're not going to embrace our carnal side, you know, of humanity. And it's always going to be about the spiritual side. And, you know, I focus on the spiritual. And so I'm going to just totally disregard everything about my emotions, about my feelings. And, you know, and I know, you know, we can go on and on about this, but I kind of want to wrap this whole idea um up because I don't know, like do you have any other final thoughts on this whole idea of embracing humanity? Because I know that we kind of we have to stop being so hard on ourselves when it comes to making mistakes. And I know the church is so good at that.
Yeah, I would say like part of what it will mean for us to find health in this area is that we learn from those that have gone before us.
Mhm.
Every human life. This is why we remember the saints. As Hebrews would say, we have a communion of saints. The other piece I'll say is like that we are people of a story, that we think more than about our individual lives.
Yeah.
You know, my life is bigger than my life. I received it as a gift, and I will one day die. And I think even that will help shape the perspective because we live in an age where we deny death just so much. We're escaping it. 30's the new 20 and 40's the new 30, and we're trying to perpetually live forever. And it's probably a good thing that one of the Christian practices we can inherit is to remember our death. Like that's what we do in Lent and on Ash Wednesday is to dust we came, and to dust we will return.
Yeah.
And that I think as soon as we begin to contemplate even our death, our life gains so much more significance. So my encouragement to your listening audience is that this is a conversation that's ongoing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a conversation that uh, learn from those that have gone before you.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Because and I've tried to make this very clear, you know, especially the people that I talk to whenever share in a message is is that I always try to do my best to encourage people study church history because it's not only their history, it's your history as well. And I think it's so very important because to understand because and I like to say this quote sometimes is where we are we cannot know where we're going unless we know where we've been. And I think that's one of the things we really need to realize is that, you know, there are so many people that have gone on before us. And this might actually, I'm not sure what your interpretation is on this verse, but there's a verse in Hebrews. It says that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses.
Yeah, I mentioned that
And
already. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think and I remember, and I think this is a very bad interpretation because a lot of people tend to believe that this is all about, well, we got all these saints that have gone on before us and they're all looking down on us, they're watching us, and kind of spurring us on to win the race. But I kind of think of it as this way, that it's very simple, is that you are in good company because these great cloud of witnesses had their share of mistakes and their shortcomings.
Right. Because that statement comes after what we sometimes call the Hall of Fame in
Yep,
Hebrews 11. Is like, it goes through every hero of the faith. And as
that's
you
right.
actually walk through that, you're like, well, these are some pretty broken people.
Yeah.
These are some people that didn't have it all together. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
and that was my and
David
that was
was,
actually my
yeah.
that was actually my first statement I was going to make at the beginning of this conversation was that when I take this Bible, right? This and I don't want to say this carefully, is that this book is full of mistakes. And the reason why I say that is because there's just so many messed up lives, right from David and to Samson and so on and so forth. Abraham, they've had
And
their
all of
share.
us, right?
All of us,
All
right?
of
And
us.
your story
Yeah.
is in here
Yeah.
too, right? Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that we really do need to recapture for ourselves. That we're not going to get it right the first time. We're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's all. Imagine if we were saints for the rest of our lives. If God, why couldn't God made us into these perfect angels? And I don't know. I mean, maybe God just wanted to have a little bit of drama just watching our lives, and maybe He
I,
enjoys that as much as we do, right? Because
I don't know about that.
yeah,
But I will say we're humanity is a dynamic reality. It's never set. And so we have the potential for good and the potential for evil. And it's our job to partner with the spirit in becoming fully in the likeness of God.
And so I kind of want to wrap this up and say that, in this conversation, and I know you'll agree with me that, it's not to say that because we are human, this doesn't give us the right to go on and just, okay, well, I can go off and make all these kinds of mistakes, because I'm human after all. But that's not an excuse. That's not a license to, I know it's very cliche, a license to sin. But at the same time, it's all part of the fight. It's all part of the growing and the learning as human beings living in, because it's not an earth suit. It's all part of the dynamic plan and purpose of God, that we were placed here on earth. That God wanted human beings on earth to be like what you said, the image bearers and the likeness of who He is, to be the perfect representative of what we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to become.
Well, thanks so much for having me on the podcast today.
Yeah, it's awesome, and I love these conversations. And if you can, for me, for a minute or two, just kind of give us a little bit of some of your platforms and some of your podcasts as well, and I'll definitely highlight those in the description and maybe even on the screen itself.
Yeah, so you can find me online at Paul Walker 87, I think is my handle, but like search me, you'll find me there. And then I'm also the co-host of a podcast with Jesus Collective, and you can find our work at jesuscollective.com. And we're a group of basically folks from around the church spheres in different denominations and networks, but we're a network that wants to discover what it means to put Jesus at the center and to be wise and thoughtful leaders towards that. So yeah, you can check us out there.
Awesome. That's so cool. Thank you for just joining me today. It was so fun. I wish that we had maybe a couple more hours just to go ahead and talk, because I know that the topics of discussion that we even had today, it could have easily gone off in so many different rabbit trails, and there's just so much to talk about. But I definitely would love to have you back on board again and just maybe talk about maybe some of the other things that we kind of thrown into the whole mix. And yeah, so thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and we will see you again on the next one. Bye-bye.